I was sitting at a dinner table in Charleston when my own son leaned forward and said, "Dad, you forget things sometimes." Then he slid a stack of papers across the table, papers to sign away my $35 million beach house. For a moment, the sting cut deeper than any insult. To be treated not as a father, but as a burden. But what he didn't know was that months earlier, I had already locked the house into an irrevocable trust, with a clause that could strip him of everything if he challenged me. And when his lawyer walked in with a smug smile, I simply set the pen down and let the silence speak for me. What happened next turned that quiet dinner into the fight of my life, one that ended with a verdict he never saw coming. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of my Charleston beach house, gilding the wood floors and making the ocean outside glitter like it was set with diamonds. The air carried salt and warmth, the kind that always reminded me of my late wife, Margaret, and the years we spent fighting to keep this place. It wasn't just a house, it was where we raised our children, where birthdays and Christmases felt alive. It was where her laughter lingered even now. The waves rolled steady, a rhythm that calmed me as I sipped my coffee on the porch. My cane leaned against the railing, though some mornings I told myself I didn't need it. The place felt too large for one man, yet it anchored me. It was proof that my sacrifices hadn't been for nothing. The computer on the desk pinged with an incoming email. My son's name, Marshall, flashed across the screen. My stomach tightened before I even clicked. "Dinner tonight," the message read. "Bring your ID and the property papers for review. No greeting, no warmth, just a command, dressed as a reminder." I stared at the words, a coldness spreading through my chest. The request for documents was out of place. Wrong. I told myself I was imagining things, that perhaps Marshall simply wanted to talk business over oysters and bourbon. Still, a knot twisted inside me. The day wore on slowly. By late afternoon, I had convinced myself it was only dinner, a chance, maybe, to repair what had been broken between us. Clara, my daughter, had often stepped in to soften Marshall's sharper edges, urging me not to give up on him. Perhaps this was her doing. I pulled on a navy blazer, smoothed my white shirt, and polished the shoes I'd once worn to his law school graduation. Maisie, my granddaughter, had loved those shoes, saying they made me look like a real Southern gentleman. I smiled faintly at the memory, then closed the door behind me. The streets of Charleston's French Quarter hummed with early summer life. Couples strolled hand in hand. Tourists licked dripping ice cream cones. Families filled the benches outside the candy shops. I moved among them quietly, cane tapping the cobblestones, feeling like a ghost walking past scenes of joy. Every turn of the street reminded me of what I had built for my children and how far they had drifted. The restaurant stood glowing with lantern light, polished wood doors welcoming guests. Inside, the host greeted me politely, but the table chosen for us told another story. Near the kitchen doors, where the clatter of pans and shouts of cooks drowned conversation, a small table waited. Heat and noise pressed against me like an unspoken insult. I sat stiffly, gripping the cane beside me. Marshall wasn't there yet, but I noticed an extra chair pulled aside. Someone else was expected. The knot inside me drew tighter. When Marshall arrived, he carried himself like a man in control of the room, even if the room didn't notice him. He leaned down and kissed my cheek, a gesture rehearsed rather than heartfelt. "Dad," he said, smiling wide enough for the server to see. "This is just us smoothing things over." Clara followed, setting her purse down carefully. She didn't speak, but her eyes darted between us, her posture tense. I watched Marshall fiddle with his phone, avoiding my gaze. He ordered drinks for the table, voice light, almost jovial. To anyone else, we might have looked like a family mending fences, but his hands betrayed him. The restless tapping, the way his smirk flickered whenever he glanced at me. The air around us felt staged, like we were actors in a play I hadn't rehearsed for. My chest tightened as I leaned forward. "You'll thank me later," Marshall said softly, leaning close enough so Clara wouldn't hear. "For letting me handle the house. The words sliced through the clatter of dishes and the hum of conversation. My fingers curled around the edge of the table, steadying myself. This wasn't reconciliation. It was a setup, and I had just stepped onto his stage. The server set down our drinks, condensation dripping down the glass onto the cheap paper coaster. Marshall's smirk spread slowly, as though he had been waiting for just this moment. "Dad," he said lightly, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, "you forget things sometimes." The words landed harder than I let on. A few diners turned their heads, curiosity flickering in their eyes before they quickly looked away. The sting wasn't just the insult, it was the casual cruelty. The deliberate choice to say it in public. For a man who had spent a lifetime keeping his family's dignity intact, that cut deeper than I cared to admit. Clara sat frozen, her hands folded in her lap. She didn't meet my eyes, and her silence ached more than Marshall's jab. A daughter who once begged me to keep the peace now stared at the salt shaker, unwilling to defend her father. I lifted the glass, letting the cold touch settle against my palm, forcing myself to stay calm. Silence, I reminded myself, was its own kind of shield. The meal carried on in shallow waves of small talk. Marshall filled the space with stories about his business deals, each detail louder than the last. The clatter of plates and hum of conversation around us blurred into background noise until the waiter arrived with the check. "Dad's covering. He always does," Marshall announced with a grin that wasn't a grin at all. His voice carried across the room, and I could see heads turning again. The waiter placed the leather folder in front of me, hesitant, almost apologetic. For decades, I had picked up every check without a thought. Anniversaries, birthdays, Christmas dinners, if the family gathered, I paid. It had been an act of love, a quiet way to remind them they were cared for. Now, my son had twisted that generosity into ridicule, a public humiliation for strangers to witness. I slid the credit card across without a word. The silence pressed heavier than the bill itself. When the waiter stepped away, I steadied my breathing. Anger would give Marshall what he wanted. Instead, I traced the rim of my glass and let him talk. His laughter felt rehearsed, a performance for an audience I couldn't yet see. The chair beside Clara remained empty, though it had been pulled back just slightly from the table. Its vacancy gnawed at me. Someone was meant to join us, someone Marshall had prepared for. Clara's eyes flickered toward it, just once, then darted away. That tiny movement confirmed my suspicion. She knew, and her silence betrayed me more than her brother's sneer. I wanted to ask her, to force her to choose between blood and conscience, but the lump in my throat held me back. Marshall leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice low but sharp. "If you just sign the papers, we won't have these awkward moments." His tone dripped with false concern, like he was offering a way out of embarrassment. He wanted me cornered, ashamed enough to surrender. My hand tightened around the fork, but I set it down deliberately, choosing composure over rage. Silence again. Let him stew in it. Marshall smirked wider, convinced he'd scored another victory. He mistook patience for weakness, just as he always had. And then the restaurant door swung open. A figure stepped inside, tall, precise, carrying a briefcase polished to a mirror shine. Victor Havelock. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on us, and he began walking toward our table with a practiced smile. The pit in my stomach told me everything at once. This dinner was never about family. Victor Havelock slid into the empty chair as though he'd been expected all along. The briefcase he set down landed with a dull thud that rattled the silverware. The sound didn't belong in a place like this. It belonged in a courthouse, a boardroom, anywhere but a table that was supposed to be about family. His tailored suit caught the dim light, and his eyes never once looked at me with anything resembling kindness. Marshall, on the other hand, leaned back like a man who'd just won a bet. "Dad, this is for everyone's good," he said, his grin sharp enough to cut glass. The room suddenly felt smaller, my fork stilled above the plate, and though the chatter of other diners carried on, all I could hear was the slow, deliberate clicking of Victor's latches as he opened the case. I already knew what was inside, but the dread of seeing it with my own eyes burned in my gut. He slid the documents toward me across the linen, a neat stack, bound in a folder, the title bold, Gift Deed. I didn't need to read the lines to understand what they were. Legal papers that would strip the house from my name and hand it over to Marshall. "This is just a formality," Victor said smoothly, voice practiced, detached. "Protects your assets, keeps everything streamlined, a routine step for a family of your stature." My hands trembled as I reached for the first page. The paper felt heavier than it should, every word blurred under the weight of memory. The image of laying brick by brick with my late wife, the years of saving every dime to keep that mortgage paid, came flooding back. I saw Maisie running barefoot along the deck, her laugh carried by the ocean breeze. This house wasn't just wood and stone, it was the marrow of my life. Marshall mistook my hesitation for surrender. "Go ahead, Dad." We all know it's what Mom would have wanted, but my wife had never once wanted this. She'd died clinging to the belief that the house was our family's anchor, not a bargaining chip. My fingers tightened around the pen, but instead of moving it across the page, I let it rest, unmoving. Then Marshall reached into his jacket and pulled out another paper, a thinner sheet, but more dangerous than the stack before it. My name was already typed across the top. "A quick test," he said, as if it were nothing, "just to make sure everyone knows you're capable of making these decisions." The words hung in the air like poison, a cognitive test. My own son, insinuating I was no longer of sound mind. The betrayal wasn't in the ink, but in the smirk plastered on his face, the way he twisted concern into accusation. Heat crept up my neck. The restaurant suddenly seemed too bright. Every sound amplified, the clink of glasses, the scrape of chairs, the forced laughter from tables nearby. Clara sat frozen, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't look at me, didn't look at Marshall, just stared at the tablecloth as if silence could shield her. But silence was its own verdict. Humiliation seeped through every pore. It wasn't enough to take the house. They wanted to brand me incompetent, to strip me of dignity before strangers. I picked up the pen again, holding it just above the line. For a moment, I let them believe I might give in. Marshall leaned forward, eyes gleaming, Victor's lips twitching with anticipation, and then I set the pen down, deliberately, slowly. The motion was quiet, but final, the only refusal I could make without giving them the fight they were baiting me into. The silence stretched, thick as smoke. My refusal spoke louder than anger ever could. Marshall's smirk returned. He leaned toward Victor, his voice low, but not low enough. "He'll break soon." I pressed my lips together, every muscle in my jaw tight, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a single word. The waiter returned with a tray, clearing away what little remained of our dinner. The plates clattered as he stacked them, but no one at the table spoke. Only the stack of papers stayed behind, sitting between us like a stubborn shadow. My son glanced at them with the confidence of a man convinced the outcome was inevitable. Marshall broke the silence first, forcing a laugh that sounded rehearsed. "Dad's just nervous," he said to Victor, patting the folder. "He'll come around." His words landed like a slap, as though my hesitation was weakness rather than will. The silence on my side wasn't born of confusion, it was deliberate, weighted. Each second I refused to speak tightened the coil inside him, and I could see the twitch in his jaw. My stillness unsettled him more than any argument would have. The trick, I remembered, was not to let their noise become mine. Victor leaned forward, resting his hand on the folder as if the gesture might bridge the growing gap. "It's a standard transfer, Mr. Kelling. Nothing more. Just routine. Your signature is a formality." His voice carried the cadence of courtrooms, cool and persuasive, but to me it sounded hollow. Across the table, Clara's eyes flickered to mine. For the briefest moment, there was something human there. Regret, maybe even shame. But it vanished as quickly as it came. She turned away, tucking her hair behind her ear as though refusing to see me might absolve her from the role she played. That glance cut deeper than Victor's polished words. A ring of moisture from my water glass spread slowly onto the first page of the contract. I didn't move the glass. I let it stain the paper, watched it soak into the fibers until the black ink blurred. A mark of resistance, quiet but indelible. Let them interpret it as carelessness. I knew it was defiance. Marshall shifted in his seat, his charm slipping away. His voice dropped, low and heavy. If you don't sign tonight, I can't promise things won't get more complicated. He let the threat hang between us, subtle but sharp. I could almost hear the weight behind it. Court filings, whispered accusations, questions about my mind. A heat rose in my chest, anger pounding against the ribs like a fist demanding to be loosed. But I steadied it, forced it back into silence. Words would give them what they wanted. Words could be twisted. Silence. Silence left them with nothing. I thought of my father, who once told me in the middle of a bitter family quarrel, sometimes the sharpest blade you carry is the one you don't unsheathe. The memory steadied me now. Leaning back, I folded my arms, grounding myself in stillness. My eyes locked on Marshall, not as a plea, but as a mirror. His impatience spilled out in the rhythm of his fingers drumming against the table. He whispered to Victor, forgetting, or perhaps not caring that I could hear, "He's testing us." But they were wrong. This wasn't a test. It was my line in the sand. My silence wasn't surrender. It was my shield. The room felt close, the air thick with tension. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost trembling, but it sliced through the space like glass cracking in the dark. "Marshall," she said, her eyes fixed on the folder. Not him. "Maybe this isn't the way." Her words landed heavier than any argument I could have made. Clara's words trembled in the air, fragile as glass about to shatter. "Marshall, maybe this isn't the way." Her voice should have cooled the fire, but instead it lit the fuse. Marshall's palm slammed against the table with a crack that startled the diners nearby. The sound rattled through me like thunder, not because of its force, but because it came from my own son. His smile was gone, his mask slipping away. For a moment, the clatter of dishes and murmurs of conversation filled the silence he left. Then he leaned across the table, his voice low, sharp, and venomous. "If you won't sign tonight, I'll make sure the court decides you can't." The words landed harder than his hand on the wood, not just a threat, but a promise. My chest tightened, the years of sacrifice I had poured into that house rushing back all at once. The mortgage checks mailed late at night, the repairs done by calloused hands. The dream of leaving something solid for the family I thought would honor it. Clara covered her face, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. She whispered, almost to herself, "Marshall, you're pushing too far." He didn't even glance her way. He stared only at me, waiting for me to break. I steadied my breath. My hand gripped the edge of the table until the knuckles whitened, but my voice stayed calm. "You can't erase me from my own house." Victor Havelock cleared his throat, adjusting the stack of papers as though brushing aside sentiment. "Mr. Kelling," he said, smooth as ice, "refusing could trigger a guardianship motion. If the court believes you're unfit, this matter can be taken out of your hands entirely." So there it was, the ambush revealed in full daylight. They hadn't come to share food, or family, or even arguments. They had come with a plan, polished and rehearsed. For a moment I saw myself reflected in the dark window of the restaurant. An old man, shoulders bent from years of work, but eyes sharp enough to see the trap they thought I'd step into. I let my gaze drift to the contract, the ink crisp against the paper. Decades of memories rose unbidden. The first summer after buying the place. The smell of salt air as my late wife carried a basket of sandwiches onto the porch. The laughter of children running barefoot through the sand. That house was more than property. It was proof of a life lived, a legacy carved into wood and stone. I slid the stack back across the table, the pages whispering against each other. My hand didn't tremble anymore. My voice was steady. "No." Marshall's face reddened, veins pressing at his temples. He leaned closer, his words spilling out like poison. "If you resist me, then you won't see Maisie again. Not one weekend. Not one summer. She's mine to decide about, not yours." The world tilted for a second. The air sucked from the room. That was the deepest cut yet, sharper than any legal threat. My granddaughter, my anchor, the last spark of joy left in the family, held hostage in this battle. For one heartbeat I nearly faltered. But then something steadier rose inside me. The chatter in the restaurant quieted. Forks paused midair. People leaned subtly to catch the whispers of a family tearing itself apart in public. My son didn't care. He wanted to break me here, where everyone could see. I reached for my cane, slowly, deliberately. My knees ached, but I rose. The scrape of my chair against the floor was louder than his threats. My eyes met his, not with fury, but with something firmer. Finality. If this is how you treat me, then we're done here. The words carried more weight than I intended. They shook in the air, not from weakness, but because they carried the gravity of decades collapsing all at once. I turned toward the door, Clara still weeping, Victor frowning, and Marshall's jaw tightening like steel. You've lost more than a signature tonight, son. The room seemed to freeze with that sentence, the whole restaurant suspended in the silence that followed. Then the sound of my cane striking the floor cut through the who. The law office smelled faintly of leather and old wood, a quiet place that should have felt safe. Instead, every step across the polished floor carried the echo of Marshall's words. I'll see you in court. Eldon Brackett, my attorney, motioned me inside. His desk was already covered in papers, too many for comfort. He didn't waste time. Sliding the stack toward me, he said, "They've filed preliminary motions." The pages bore Marshall's name and Victor Havelock's signature in crisp type. I leaned closer, my pulse thudding. Words leapt off the page. Mentally unfit to manage assets. For a moment, the room tilted. After all the years of careful planning, after decades of managing accounts down to the last detail, my own son had chosen to brand me incompetent. Eldon's voice steadied me. They're not coming for the property alone. They want your independence. The words cut deep. A man can lose a house, even fortune, but to be declared incapable, that was erasure. I gripped my cane, the polished wood warm against my palm, rage coiled inside, hotter than I'd felt in years. Images surfaced unbidden, late nights poring over contracts, trips cut short to pay off loans. The sound of Maisie's laughter echoing through the halls of the beach house I nearly lost twice, but always pulled back from the brink. Those sacrifices were being rewritten into weakness. Eldon leaned back. We'll fight this. But you need to understand, August, this will get ugly. I nodded, swallowing against the dry knot in my throat. Let them come. I built this life with my own hands. They won't erase me with ink. The next morning found me still stewing over the motion. Anger had burned away the fog of shock. Every decision that led me here flashed in memory. Buying the beach house when money was tight. Insisting on keeping it after my wife passed. Refusing offers from developers who waved checks in my face. I had always been the one to hold the line. Now Marshall dared to claim I wasn't capable of doing the same. Eldon's voice broke the silence. We'll need proof. Banking records. Contracts you signed recently. Any board minutes from the charity work you're still active in. I tightened my grip on the cane. Gather it all. If they want to fight, I'll show them what a lifetime of competence looks like. But beneath the steel, another thought intruded. Maisie. The little girl who still ran to me barefoot across the sand, who pressed seashells into my hands as if they were treasures. She was the only reason to keep fighting, not for brick and mortar, but for her memory of me. Late that afternoon, Clara appeared unannounced at Eldon's office. Her face was pale, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad, I shouldn't be here. Eldon excused himself, leaving us alone. She clutched her handbag like it was a lifeline. I heard them talking, she said, eyes fixed on the carpet. Victor and Marshall. They plan to bring in a doctor willing to say you're declining. The words landed heavier than the subpoena ever could. A forgery, I said slowly. She nodded, tears brimming. I don't know what to do. He's my brother, but you're my father. I can't watch them destroy you. A mix of gratitude and sorrow washed over me. Clara's loyalty had always wavered, but now I saw the struggle tearing her apart. I laid a hand over hers. You already did the hardest thing, child. You told me the truth. Her shoulders shook, and I realized how much this fight had already cost her. That night, Eldon returned with another stack of papers. This time, the ink wasn't from Marshall, it was from the court itself. He laid the subpoena before me with the gravity of a verdict. They've set the first hearing for next week. They're moving fast. The pages blurred as my grip tightened. It wasn't age that made my hand tremble, but fury. Decades of labor, reduced to a courtroom spectacle where my own competence would be questioned. Eldon's gaze met mine. We'll need to be faster. I leaned back, steadying myself, then looked at the bold black letters at the top of the subpoena. My voice came out low but unshaken. If they want a war, they'll get one. The glow from my phone lit the dark bedroom. That text from Marshall pulsing on the screen like a threat carved in neon. Enjoy your last week of freedom. Dad. For a long while. The sound of waves outside was the only answer. That a son could write such words to his father felt more bitter than the salt in the sea air. Clara's broken confession replayed in my mind. Victor plotting forged medical testimony, a scheme designed to bury me alive in paperwork and lies. The thought twisted my chest more than age ever could. Sleep was a stranger that night. The old house creaked with the tide, and in every sound I heard echoes of betrayal. The mantel clock struck 2, then 3, each chime reminding me the week ahead was no ordinary span of days. It was a countdown, a line drawn between a man's dignity and his destruction. By morning, resolve replaced the ache. I stood at the wide kitchen window, Kane resting at my side, when Eldon's car pulled into the driveway. He walked in without ceremony, a worn leather folder tucked under his arm. His eyes carried the calm assurance of someone who'd weathered storms darker than lawsuits. I thought you might need this, he said, setting the folder on my table. Inside lay copies of the irrevocable trust I had established months ago, back when I first noticed Marshall's entitlement growing sharper, like rust eating at steel. That foresight had been born of caution, but now it felt like providence. Every clause is airtight, Eldon explained. The house, the accounts, even the charitable endowments. You're not as vulnerable as they think. As his words sank in, memory swept me back, sitting with Eldon one spring afternoon, drafting the trust while the scent of azaleas filled the office. I remembered telling him, my son's ambition worries me. Protect what's left of my name, even from my own blood. That paper shield, dismissed as paranoia at the time, had become my anchor. Later that day, Clara appeared again, her eyes swollen from sleepless nights. She clutched her purse as if it were a lifeline. Dad, he's pushing me, she whispered. He wants me to testify that you've slipped, that you can't manage things anymore. Her voice cracked, and tears slid down her face faster than she could brush them away. I took her trembling hand. The truth is, your only ally now. Don't let him trade your conscience for his greed. She nodded, though her shoulders shook with the weight of divided loyalty. Watching her torn apart like that strengthened something inside me. Their tricks, their threats. They could not command my silence anymore. That evening, Eldon returned with another explanation. He pointed to a paragraph buried deep in the trust, the no contest clause. If Marshall challenges this trust in court and fails, he forfeits everything, not just the house, every cent tied to your estate. The words landed with the force of a hammer. For the first time in weeks, my hand stopped trembling. They thought you were cornered, Eldon said, but you still hold the high ground. I traced the bold black ink across the page, the cane steady beside me. They saw an old man fading. They forgot the years of foresight, of contracts signed at midnight, of debts paid when others faltered. They forgot the will that built this house and kept it standing. As the sky outside faded to indigo, I placed the trust papers on my desk, smoothing the corners with deliberate care. If they want a war in court, I murmured to the empty room, I'll give them a battlefield they can't control. For the first time in days, the silence felt like strength, not defeat. My hand rested on the folder, steady as stone. The courthouse steps felt heavier than stone beneath my shoes. My cane struck the marble floor in steady rhythm, each tap echoing against the high ceiling of Charleston County Courthouse. Inside, the air smelled faintly of varnished oak and old paper. Marshall and Victor were already waiting near the front bench. Polished suits, smug faces. Marshall leaned in toward Victor as I entered. The corner of his mouth curled in a smirk. They came armed with papers. I came armed with memory. The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. Strangers curious about the spectacle of a father and son tearing each other apart. Oak benches stretched in neat rows. Sunlight filtered through tall windows. And at the far end, the judge adjusted his glasses before sitting. The bailiff's call silenced the room, and suddenly all eyes were on us. I lowered myself onto the chair beside Eldon Brackett, my attorney. His presence steadied me, though my hand clenched the cane tighter than usual. Just days earlier, I had opened an envelope stamped with the county seal. Inside was a notarized deed, purporting to show I had already signed over my beach house to Marshall, a signature that wasn't mine. Eldon had filed it immediately as evidence, and now here we were. Victor rose first, gliding toward the bench like he owned the room. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth as polished steel, "we have medical testimony from Dr. Keene establishing that Mr. Kelling has exhibited significant signs of memory decline. The concern, of course, is his capacity to manage a high-value property." Marshall nodded solemnly, adopting the air of the dutiful son. To the crowd, he might have looked caring, concerned. But I knew better. I watched his hands folded tightly in his lap, knuckles pale. He was rehearsing control. The document slid across the judge's bench, crisp pages stamped and initialed, forged, my life, my mind, reduced to lies on paper. Sitting there, I felt smaller than I had in years. To have everything I'd built, every mortgage payment, every late-night decision, dismissed as the fumbling of a forgetful old man cut sharper than any insult. The room seemed to lean away from me, as if the crowd already believed the story of decline. I held my breath, waiting for Eldon's cue. Eldon stood, calm but sharp-eyed. He spoke with a clarity that sliced through the fog Victor had spun. "Your Honor, these claims are not only unfounded, they are fabricated. Here are records from Mr. Kelling's banking activity, meticulous, accurate to the cent. Minutes from board meetings he chaired last month. Contracts signed just weeks ago with charitable foundations. This is not the work of a man in decline." The judge's brow lifted slightly as he accepted the folder Eldon passed forward. Then Clara was called. My heart nearly stopped. She rose from the bench, her hands trembling so hard she nearly dropped her purse. Marshall stiffened, eyes darting to her like daggers. She stood before the court, voice breaking. I heard them," she whispered, glancing at Victor. "I heard Mr. Havelock talking about arranging testimony that wasn't true, about making it look like my father was unfit." A gasp rippled across the room. Marshall's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening. Victor's eyes went narrow. A predator caught in daylight. Clara's shoulders slumped as if the weight of truth had finally broken through the silence she'd carried. My chest burned, not with shame this time, but with a flicker of hope. The judge leaned forward, tapping the papers with his gavel. "Mr. Havelock, these documents are serious." "How do you explain this testimony in light of your associate's statement?" Victor stammered, his polished veneer cracking. "Your Honor, there must be some misunderstanding." But the doors opened at the back of the courtroom, and in walked Raynor Cutler, compliance officer, briefcase in hand. His reputation preceded him. He moved with the weight of authority, nodding to the judge before stepping forward. "Your Honor," Raynor said firmly, "I have sworn documents from the medical office in question. The report presented today was altered. The original file shows no diagnosis of decline." He laid the proof on the bench, each page stamped, signed, sealed. "What's been submitted here is a forgery." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, heads turning toward Marshall and Victor. My heart steadied in my chest. For once, silence wasn't my weapon. The truth was, Marshall's face drained of color. He tried to mask it with anger, but his eyes betrayed panic. Victor's shoulders sagged, his jaw tight as he realized the trap he had walked into. The judge's gavel slammed down, silencing the noise. This court will recess. An immediate investigation will be launched into the submission of fraudulent documents. Proceedings regarding the beach house are hereby suspended until further notice. The gavel struck again, its echo rolling through the chamber, final and heavy. I sat still, letting the weight of the moment sink in, all their bluster, all their schemes, cracked open by truth. The gavel's echo carried more weight than Marshall's threats ever had. The courthouse doors swung shut behind me, the buzz of voices fading into the sticky Charleston air. My cane tapped the steps as I descended, steadying myself against the weight pressing down on my shoulders. Reporters swarmed like seagulls around a fishing boat, cameras clicking, questions thrown like stones. Through the chaos, Marshall's figure cut a straight line toward me, his eyes locked on mine, jaw tight, lips curling with something colder than anger. He leaned in close enough for only me to hear. "This isn't over, old man." The words burned more than a slap, not because of their venom, but because they came from my son, the boy I once carried on these same shoulders, the boy who used to run along the beach calling me his hero. To hear my blood speak like a stranger made every breath heavier. Clara stood a few paces back, her head lowered, arms crossed as if bracing against the tide. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at him either. Shame hung around her like a veil. The crowd whispered, hungry for scandal. I felt stripped bare, not just as a father, but as a man who had built a name, a legacy, and now watched it being chipped away in front of strangers holding microphones. Victor's voice rang out above the noise. He had positioned himself at the courthouse steps as if it were a stage, his suit immaculate, his tone calculated. He addressed the sea of cameras. "This is, above all, a family tragedy," he began smoothly. "One rooted in the difficult reality of aging and the decline of memory. We ask for compassion, for a son forced to take steps no child ever wishes to." I stood still, my grip tightening on the cane, as the words dripped into the crowd like poison. Senility, decline, a lifetime of sharp decisions, decades of sacrifice, reduced to a headline crafted by a lawyer. Marshall stood behind him, nodding solemnly, playing the role of the dutiful son burdened with responsibility. To anyone who didn't know better, the performance looked flawless. Inside, anger simmered, slow but certain. They could smear my name, twist the truth until the ink bled. But they would not erase me. The house, the memories, the blood and sweat that had built them, those belonged to me, and no speech could take that away. That evening, the house felt too quiet. The hum of the ocean outside my window no longer comforted. It reminded me of what they wanted to steal. Eldon sat across from me at the study table, his glasses sliding down his nose as he laid out files. His calm voice carried the weight of warning. "August, even with the trust in place, Marshall may escalate. If he can't win with civil papers, he might push criminal allegations, fraud, mismanagement, whatever they think might stick." The thought churned my stomach. Fraud, a word that could undo a reputation built brick by brick, year by year. I had worked overtime shifts, paid every mortgage check, turned down vacations to make sure bills were covered. Integrity had been my compass, and yet I knew how quickly false accusations could bury the truth. Clara knocked softly before entering, her face pale. She sat on the edge of the chair, hands twisting together. "Dad," she whispered, "Marshall's pushing harder. He wants me to testify. Against you." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "If I say no, Victor will destroy me socially. You know how he works." I reached across the table, resting my hand on hers. "Truth is your only ally now, and mine. That's all we've got." Her tears spilled, silent but heavy, and I felt the weight of her conflict press against my chest. My son was tearing his sister apart as well. Later, when the house had quieted again, I heard the soft shuffle of small feet. Maisie stepped into the study, her tiny hands clutching a piece of paper. She held it out without a word. It was a crayon drawing of the beach house, sun rising over the roof, waves curling at its base, her handprint stamped in the corner. The sight pierced me deeper than any courtroom accusation. This wasn't just property. This was legacy. This was memory preserved in the eyes of a child who still believed in the goodness of family. I knelt slowly, my knees stiff but steady enough to meet her gaze. "If my son wants to burn this family down," I told her gently, "I'll fight to keep one corner standing, for you." She smiled faintly, unaware of the war raging around her, then slipped the drawing into my lap before padding back down the hallway. My chest tightened, not with fear but with resolve. For Maisie, I would not bend. Just then, Eldon's phone buzzed. He answered, listening in silence. When he finally hung up, his face was grave. "They've filed a motion to freeze your assets," he said. The words hung in the air like a blade over my neck. Not just the house, everything, every dollar, every account, every piece of security I had left. The ink on Maisie's drawing blurred as my grip tightened, fury steadying my voice. The courthouse felt colder than usual that morning, though the sun was bright outside. My cane echoed on the marble floor as I walked into the hearing room, each step heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake. Across the room, Marshall and Victor sat together, whispering like conspirators, their faces set with smug confidence. Victor's leather briefcase sat open, papers neatly stacked like weapons ready to be fired. When the judge entered and the proceedings began, Victor rose with the same polished arrogance I had seen at the restaurant. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "we are requesting that Mr. August Kelling's assets be frozen pending review of his mental competence. Evidence suggests he is in decline, unable to manage his affairs." The words struck like blows. Decline. Unfit. They didn't argue against what I had built. They argued against me. For a moment, I felt the courtroom watching me as though I were already guilty of weakness, but I straightened my shoulders and met the judge's eyes. If they wanted me humiliated, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Eldon stood slowly, calm and deliberate. His presence was steady, the counterweight to Victor's slick performance. He laid out folders on the bench. "Your Honor, what we have here are verified bank records showing consistent management, contracts signed by Mr. Kelling, and minutes from charitable board meetings where he actively participated this year." The judge leaned forward. Eldon handed copies to the clerk. Then Raynor Cutler, the compliance officer, stepped forward with quiet authority. "I have reviewed these documents personally. There is no indication Mr. Kelling is incompetent in financial matters. In fact, his management has been precise." A murmur spread through the courtroom. The smug tilt of Victor's mouth faded. Marshall shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glaring at Eldon as though sheer anger could change the facts. For the first time, I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. When Clara was called, the air thickened. She rose slowly, her voice trembling at first. I was told what to say before," she confessed. "Victor suggested certain words to make my father appear confused, less reliable." Gasps rippled across the benches. My heart clenched. To hear my own daughter admit she had been guided into betraying me cut deeper than any accusation. Yet beneath the sting, relief swelled. Finally, she had spoken truth. The judge held up a hand for silence. "Mrs. Vassell, are you saying your earlier statements were influenced?" Clara nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. "Yes, Your Honor." Victor tried to object, but the damage was done. The judge's face was unreadable as he noted everything carefully. "Given these developments, this court will delay a final decision. Both parties will have 2 weeks to present further verified evidence. Until then, the matter remains unresolved." The gavel struck once, the sound sharp enough to jolt the breath from my chest. Outside the courtroom, the facade cracked. Marshall's voice carried through the crowd. "You're ruining this family," he shouted, face red with fury. Reporters leaned in. cameras clicking. For years, I had endured his barbs in silence, hoping patience might bridge the gap between us. But something inside had shifted. This time, my reply was firm, my voice steady despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. "No, Marshall," I said, loud enough for all to hear. "You ruined it the moment you chose greed over blood." His eyes blazed, but there was no laughter in them anymore, only rage. That night, in the quiet of my study, Eldon sat across from me, papers spread across my desk. He looked tired but determined. "They've filed an emergency appeal. August. Victor is escalating this to the higher court. They want war, and now they've declared it on every front." I leaned back. Maisie's drawing pinned to the wall behind me, its crayon lines brighter than the legal papers between us. A storm was gathering, but the anchor was still there. For her, I couldn't surrender. The study felt like a sanctuary that no longer offered peace. The only light came from the lamp on my desk, shining across scattered papers and the single drawing pinned on the wall. Maisie had sketched the beach house with a child's uneven strokes, but to me it was perfect. Her little handwriting at the bottom, Grandpa's house, was more binding than any deed. That picture reminded me this wasn't just a fight over wood and stone. It was memory, legacy, and survival. The clock ticked toward midnight, and the weight of tomorrow pressed harder than sleep ever could. I knew Marshall wouldn't ease up. If anything, he'd sharpen his knives. In the quiet, I steadied my breath, telling myself the same words my father once told me when I faced my first hardship. "You endure. That's how you win." By morning, I was dressed in my best Navy suit, cane steady in my hand. The mediation room wasn't a courtroom, but it carried the same suffocating tension. Marshall and Victor were already seated, whispering as though they were planning a strategy in the middle of a game. Clara sat a seat away, her shoulders stiff, eyes red. The mediator, a tall man with wire-rimmed glasses, called us to order. "This is a chance for resolution without prolonging the harm," he said evenly. I wondered if he knew harm had already been done long before we stepped into this room. Victor cleared his throat and slid a folder across the table with the same smug precision he'd used that night at the restaurant. "Mr. Kelling has not disclosed all of his assets," he announced. "We've uncovered suggestions of offshore accounts." The words stung like acid. Offshore accounts? I'd worked every year of my life in this city, sweating under Carolina heat, teaching classes, investing carefully, paying taxes on every cent. "Produce your proof," I said, voice calm but sharp. Victor adjusted his tie, trying to mask the stumble. The mediator frowned. "Do you have evidence, or only speculation?" Marshall leaned forward, eyes blazing. "It's obvious Dad's hiding something. How else could he?" The mediator cut him off. "Obvious is not evidence." Murmurs rippled from the assistants at the back of the room. For the first time, Victor's confidence wavered. I sat straighter, refusing to let their lies carry me down. Still, inside, the hurt gnawed deep. To be painted as dishonest after a lifetime of trying to live clean, that was betrayal beyond any courtroom tactic. Then Clara's voice cracked the air. "Stop." She pushed back her chair, standing on trembling legs. Her eyes met mine, glassy with tears. "Dad, I'm sorry." The words silenced the room. She turned toward the mediator, voice breaking. "I let them use me. I repeated things I didn't believe because I was afraid of Marshall, afraid of what Victor could do if I didn't go along. But I can't sit here and watch my father be destroyed." My chest tightened. Bitterness and relief warred within me. I wanted to ask why it had taken her this long, but I swallowed it. She had finally spoken, and in her apology, I heard the daughter I thought I had lost. The mediator scribbled notes. "This is serious testimony. It undermines the credibility of prior claims." He looked at Victor with pointed suspicion. Victor's jaw tightened, his rehearsed calm unraveling. Marshall muttered something under his breath, too low for the record but full of venom. After a pause, the mediator announced, "Given the conflicting accounts, the court will delay a decision for 2 weeks. Further evidence must be presented before any final ruling." The air in the room shifted, heavy with the sense of unfinished war. Outside, Marshall erupted. His voice rang through the corridor. You're ruining this family. Dad. His words drew stares from strangers, but he didn't care. My cane planted firm against the floor. I faced him. No, Marshall, you ruined this family when you chose greed over blood. The hallway froze around us. For once, I didn't care about whispers or shame. My words belonged in the open. His face reddened, lips curled into a snarl. This isn't over, he spat, storming down the corridor, Victor on his heels. Hours later, I sat back in my study. The lamp glowed over Maisie's drawing, the walls of the house she loved. My body ached with exhaustion, but my mind stayed sharp, awake with the echo of the mediator's warning. If this battle dragged on, the court might consider placing the estate under independent management. That would mean losing not just to my son, but to strangers. It would mean the house no longer belonged to family hands at all. I leaned back, staring at the picture of the house, my granddaughter's crooked lines. I would not allow that future. The phone rang. Eldon's voice came through, tight with urgency, but laced with a flicker of hope. August. There's been a development. The investigation into Victor's forged documents. Something has turned. I gripped the receiver tighter, heart steadying for the next storm. The courthouse steps looked steeper that morning, though I'd climbed them 100 times before. Eldon Brackett walked beside me, his steady presence reminding me I wasn't alone. Inside, the air was thick with whispers. Neighbors, former colleagues, even faces I hadn't seen in years filled the benches. They weren't here for money. They came to watch whether dignity could still stand against betrayal. The judge entered, robes brushing the polished wood floor. My cane tapped once against the bench as I steadied myself, reminding my knees they still had strength left. This wasn't about a house of bricks and cedar shingles. It was about the years of labor, the nights of loneliness, the promises whispered to a wife long gone. Victor Havelock rose first, confidence dripping from his tone. He repeated the tired story of decline, waving papers as if they could bury a man's soul. Marshall sat rigid, face carved into a mask of false concern. For a moment, I almost pitied him, how far he'd fallen to think betrayal could pass for love. Eldon stood, his voice calm but edged with steel. He laid out the fresh forensic report. Raynor Cutler was sworn in, each word cutting through the fog of lies. He pointed out the mismatched signatures, the timelines that bent reality, the pages Victor had doctored. The judge leaned forward, brows tight. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The fortress Victor had built began to crumble. Then Clara rose. Her hands shook, but her voice carried across the wood-paneled room. She admitted her silence, her fear, her shame at standing with Marshall when she should have stood with me. "I was wrong," she whispered, though every corner of the room heard her. Tears blurred her face as she looked at me, not as a lawyer's client, not as a target of schemes, but as her father. The weight in my chest loosened. Betrayal had scarred me, but truth still found a voice. The judge's gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. He ruled with finality. The beach house and all assets remained under my control. Marshall's motions were denied. Victor's conduct would be investigated for disbarment, and then, like the tide pulling back, silence filled the room. Marshall erupted. He cursed, fists clenched, face red with rage, but no one followed him. Even Clara turned away. Maisie, who had sat quietly with a sketchbook on her lap, ran into my arms as the echoes of her father's fury faded. Her small hands wrapped around mine, an anchor against the storm. That evening, the house glowed gold in the setting sun. I stood on the balcony, the Atlantic stretching wide before me. Maisie pressed against my side, her drawing of the house clutched in her hand. I thought of everything I had lost, my son's trust, the dream of a family unbroken. Yet the waves reminded me of what remained, dignity defended, legacy preserved, and the quiet truth that love, when chosen, outlasts greed. Wealth had never been the point. The lesson carved into every beam of that home was clear. Family cannot be bought, and a man's worth cannot be stolen by lies. As the sun slipped into the horizon, I whispered to myself, not in triumph, but in peace. Dignity, once defended, can never be stolen.